Hello, everyone. You are more than welcome to the Irish Women's Lobby First Conference, Speak Up for Women's Rights, celebrating International Women's Day 2021. We are delighted to have so many women tuning in to us for our conference today. And while most of the attendees are from here in Ireland, we are really pleased to see so many women registering from the UK, as well as the USA, Canada, and from across Europe. A few men have also registered, and we are delighted to welcome them too, to hear from our illustrious all-women panel of speakers discussing some of the pressing issues affecting women and girls, both here in Ireland and across the globe. And it is really remarkable that on this International Women's Day, that an all-woman panel is a rare bird indeed. So today also marks the launch of the Irish Women's Lobby, which was formed to strive for the recognition of women's rights, to provide political and media representation for women and girls in Ireland, which is badly needed in the face of the demand from Amnesty International and the National Women's Council of Ireland that we be denied them. And the lobby was also formed to highlight the need to advocate for female-specific issues and to protect women and girls from male violence. In keeping with the women-centred focus to this conference, both our panels will be addressing issues that are relevant to these themes. Unfortunately, we do not have a representative from migrant women in Ireland. The woman who had agreed to speak on the experience of this vulnerable and marginalised group was pressured to withdraw by both activists and individual members of statutory agencies who have really disgraced themselves by doing so. Before I introduce our Irish panel, I just want to let everyone know the running format. I will be introducing the Irish panel. Each woman will speak for 10 minutes, and at the end of the Irish section, I shall ask each panelist a question drawn from the questions posted by the attendees. I shall then hand over to Miriam, who will present the women speaking on the international panel. Ruth Breslin has over 20 years of research experience in both NGOs and in academic settings. Ruth's work is focused on tackling and preventing violence against women and girls, and she has led a number of large-scale research projects on prostitution and trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation. Since 2018, she has been a core member of the research team at SERP, the Sexual Exploitation Research Programme at University College Dublin. Amongst her impressive portfolio of research studies, Ruth is the lead author of SERP studies on the health impacts of prostitution and on the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on Ireland's sex trade. And she is co-author of SERP's comprehensive study on the commercial sex trade in Ireland with regard to the application of current prostitution legislation. Stella O'Malley is a psychotherapist, best-selling author, public speaker, and parent with many years' experience working in counselling and psychotherapy. Much of Stella's counselling and teaching work is with parents and young people. Stella's latest book, Fragile, was released in 2019 and focuses on overcoming anxiety and stress. Stella has regularly appeared on national and local radio and television, and she is a regular contributor to both the Irish Independent and the Sunday Independent, as well as other national and international media outlets. Stella also has 2 podcasts, Secret of the Mother World and Gender, A Wider Lens, a podcast exploring gender, identity and transition from the psychological perspective. Annette McKay is a campaigner for justice for the 796 children buried in the sewage system at the Tuam Mother and Babies Home. Annette's mother, Maggie O'Connor, was confined to the notorious Bon Secours Mother and Baby Home in Tuam, County Galway, at the age of 17, when she became pregnant after being raped. Annette believes that her older sister, Mary Margaret, could be among the 796 babies and infants found buried there. Highly critical of the official Commission of Investigation report on the mother and baby homes, Annette is one of 6 women who made an official complaint to the Gardaí following the alleged destruction of the oral testimonies given by the survivors to the Mother and Babies Home Commission of Investigation. Annette is also a former Labour councillor, and she now sits as an independent councillor for Bury. Rachel Moran is the founding member of Space International and author of the best-selling, paid for, My Journey Through Prostitution, regarded by legal scholar Catherine McKinnon as the best work by anyone on prostitution ever. Her work has also been endorsed by Jane Fonda, US President Jimmy Carter, Gloria Steinem, Robin Morgan, and many others. Her book, Paid For, has been translated into several languages and is currently being translated into Spanish and has to date been published in 10 countries. Rachel was made homeless at 14 and was prostituted for 7 years from the age of 15. Reclaiming her life and autonomy, Rachel later completed her education and earned a degree in journalism from DCU and a master's in creative writing from UCD. As an abolitionist campaigner, Rachel was instrumental in bringing the Nordic model to Ireland in 2 different processes either side of the border, and she works centrally within the international survivors movement, which calls for the implementation of the abolitionist model worldwide. She speaks regularly at the United Nations, the European Parliament, and other global institutions. Rachel is also one of the co-founders of the Irish Women's Lobby. Now, before I introduce our first panelist, I just want to give a quick message to the attendees. Contrary to popular rumour, and unlike some others, we are not in receipt of funding from dubious sources. But some women have asked how they can financially support the Irish Women's Lobby. So just to let you know, we have put a Buy Me a Coffee link on our website, irishwomenslobby.ie, for those who are in a position to make a donation. All the funds raised will be used to defray the hosting and platforming costs of this event, as well as to pay for the future events that we will be holding. So now to our panel. First to speak is Ruth Breslin. Ruth, you are very welcome. And now I will turn the mic over to you.
Thank you so much, Christine. It's fantastic to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm going to get through the technical bit and hopefully share my screen with you all. Yes, there we are. So I'm with SERP, the Sexual Exploitation Research Programme based in UCD, as Christine said. And over the last 3.5 years, we've done a number of, and 3 in fact, quite significant studies on the sex trade in Ireland. So I'm presenting some of the latest evidence on this now. So first of all, I just want to talk about, I suppose, the 3 key groups that we've researched that are involved in the trade: the women who are in prostitution, the sex buyers who purchase sexual access to those women, and the pimps and profiteers who financially benefit from the trade. So first, the women. This is a long list of the profile of the women, I suppose, but in short, to say that the vast majority of women in prostitution in Ireland are migrant women. Many are very young and many are very vulnerable. So we'll see 1,000 mainly migrant women involved at any one time, with over 40 nationalities represented in the Irish sex trade, from Latin America, from Central and Eastern Europe, and also from Africa in particular. On the most popular website, where the vast majority of women in prostitution in Ireland are advertised, you will find over 650 women advertised on a daily basis. As I said, many are young. 1/3 are advertised at the ages of between 18 and 25, with quite a lot of teenagers on there, age 18 and 19. In all of our studies with women, we found that many of them, as migrant women new to Ireland, have limited English, and in some cases no English at all when they first start off in the Irish sex trade. Many have very insecure immigration status. They might be undocumented or on a very short-term visa. Some are asylum seekers. We see that the women are highly mobile. They are moving or being moved all around the country for the purposes of prostitution. And that typically is to satisfy the demand from buyers, from sex buyers, for new faces, for new girls in all locations. So actually our research has found that a lot of women are NFA, of no fixed abode. They live and sleep in whatever brothel they're in and are moved from brothel to brothel at all times. So they have no stable accommodation, no stable place to live. We have found ample evidence in our research of direct coercion of women into the sex trade by pimps and traffickers. But we also see a great deal of women who have experienced, I suppose, that coercive factor in terms of poverty, a coercive factor that's pushed them into the trade, and they're under very significant and severe financial pressures. So all of these things, as you can imagine, makes the women very isolated, often very marginalized, often hard to reach. So I just wanted to share this with you from Elena, a young woman I interviewed from Latin America who's currently involved in the trade. And she talks about that kind of entrapment and the isolation. So she says, I go there to Ireland because I want to improve my English. But how I work and go to school, I could not, because the clients want me during the day and in the night. So for you to pay, she means to live, to survive, you need to do escorting, as she describes it, the whole time. It's like one circle. It's crazy because you don't stop. I had panic attacks. I started to take pills about this. And yes, it's changed a lot in my life because I can't have a relationship. I can't go out. I can't do nothing, you know. Like, yes, I save money. I help my family. And that's what a lot of women are doing, are supporting families. I help my family, but I feel like so much pressure in me. It's not life. And similarly, Natala talks about what I suppose her experiences of being involved, but she has been in the trade for quite some time. She talks about what she does to deal with a difficult client. She has various techniques. But then you realize what she means when she's talking about a difficult client. They, the buyers, are the king, right? If they try to do something without a condom or something I really don't like, I give the money back. So she gives them the money back to get them out of the door as quickly as possible. And then she describes, I have one guy, he paid an hour. He stayed 40 minutes really raping me because there was blood on the condom. He tried hard with anal, but because he could not feel nothing and he was done with me, he stayed 40 minutes and I gave him his money back and asked him to leave. And I prefer that way. So when they leave, I text and I say, please don't call me again. And I block the number. And shocking as that example it is just one example of the violence, and the levels of sexual violence are absolutely rife in the trade and experienced by the women from buyers, but also from the pimps and the organizers. Okay, so who are the buyers? In contrast to the migrant women, they're primarily Irish, married or in a relationship, and tend to be well educated with incomes above the national average. All of our research on the buyers has shown that they're motivated very much by a strong sense of sexual entitlement and essentially the pursuit of their own desires. We also found a great deal of evidence that the buyers are aware of signs that women in the trade may be pimped or controlled, but this is literally no concern of theirs. They are not concerned about that. So just from words from the buyers themselves, we studied hundreds and hundreds of buyer reviews between wave 1 and wave 2 of the COVID-19 pandemic last year in Ireland. Buyers on the same site where they select women to purchase sexual access to, they also rate them out of 5 stars. They rate women for their appearance, the sexual satisfaction she gave the buyer, and the value for money. And they leave comments about their so-called encounter with the women. So here, what these buyers are really saying is that they describe that they feel very much entitled to purchase sexual access to women, even during a global pandemic, and regardless of the health consequences of that for all involved. So this guy is saying, after suffering from blue ball syndrome with being stuck at home for most of the time. So he was in lockdown, he was frustrated, he was annoyed, and slowly growing an arm Popeye will be proud of, I decided to bite the bullet and try something different. A good experience, and sorted these blue balls of mine big time. This guy's complaining that he was unhappy with the service he received. The service was rushed, she was clearly too busy, in and out in 10 minutes. My hand, unfortunately, had to be the tool in the end. So it seems to me like equating a woman's body to a tool or something that you use to sort out blue balls, I suppose just gives you a sense of the extent to which buyers objectify and really dehumanize the women that they're purchasing sexual access to. We know that women of colour are disproportionately represented in the sex trade across the globe, and that's reflected here in these buyers' views in terms of the kind of racial and ethnic stereotyping. So this guy says, if you like mature African ladies, this girl is perfect. Next time I want a big size ebony gal, he's talking about a black woman, this girl is top of the list. I have to admit I have a fetish for petite Asian girls. From the moment we met, she treated me like a king, fulfilling my deep and dark desires, whilst focusing on my every need. Guys, if you love petite girls who know how to slide, grind and shift as they work their slender frame around yours, this is the girl for you. Interesting that Natalia was reflecting earlier about the fact that the buyer is king, and their satisfaction is paramount. This guy also thinks that the buyers are king. And again, these are examples from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds that I've read with similar kind of themes coming through. So who are the third groups? The pimps and the profiteers. The Irish sex trade is worth 180 million euro per annum, and that is quite an old estimate now, so it's likely to be greater than that. People forget that this is a big business. It really is a big business, and there is absolutely so much evidence across the board from so many different sources of the involvement of organised crime gangs in the trade, both domestic and international. We see the organised movement of women around the country from place to place, again to satisfy the demands of buyers in different locations. We see the presence of bookers who essentially arrange for the buyer to be able to see the woman they've selected online, and of course the pimps. We found a great deal of very concerning evidence about women who have no control over the buyers they see or the number of buyers, very little control or input into how they're advertised or the sex acts that they are supposed to perform. And also it was really interesting when we looked across the range of kind of gang activities in this area. We found that there are so many organised crime gangs that are involved in organising prostitution, but they have other illegal businesses as well. Robbery, blackmail, credit card claiming, supply of drugs, money laundering, fraud, cybercrime, the list goes on. And of course, there are many other profiteers in the trade, the advertisers, including the online platforms that advertise, and the landlords that are charging extortionate rents for their properties to be used as brothels. And of course, violence, as I said, is rife in the trade and used as a means to coerce, control, and eliminate the competition. So I just wanted to give some attention to what I think is perhaps the silent majority. So when we talk about the issue of prostitution, we are always, kind of given the mantra that we must listen to sex workers. But the fact is, the majority of women in prostitution in Ireland do not identify as sex workers. As lots of women have said to me, prostitution is not who I am. It's just something I have to do. And so we have many women, as I've described at the beginning, who are migrant, who are mobile, not resident in Ireland, have limited English, who are not well or authentically represented by the sex work lobby groups in Ireland. They do not have the opportunity, and in many cases the freedom, to be engaging in any kind of political activism around sex work or anything else, because really they're just trying to live and survive and get by day to day. So the question is, who represents them? And is it really nobody who's effectively representing them? Are they a silent and perhaps also silenced majority? And very finally, I just want to say something about the models that either counter or promote the trade. In Ireland since 2017, we've had our kind of version of what's often known as the Nordic or quality model. It decriminalises those who sell sex, absolutely rightly so. It criminalises those who purchase it because we're tackling the demand. The trade doesn't exist without the buyers. So if we criminalise, we deter some buyers at least. And then we have older legislation which sanctions organisers and the profiteers, those who financially benefit from the trade. But what we often hear from the sex work lobby is a call for the full decriminalisation model. And although that maybe sounds like a positive thing, if we really understand what that looks like, very rightly it calls for the decriminalisation of those who sell sex, but it also calls for the decriminalisation of those who purchase it, and crucially for the decriminalisation of the organisers and profiteers. So who is most thrilled when they hear proposals for a model like this? The buyers are delighted, of course, because they can continue to purchase sexual access to women with impunity. But those that are most delighted of all, most thrilled by it, are of course the organisers and the profiteers, because it means one illicit aspect of their business can be made legitimate overnight, and they can profit and they can grow even more. Because under a full decriminalisation model, it's not your friendly local florist or grocer who opens up a brothel. It's the same guys we talked about earlier who involved in the credit card cloning, the fraud, the robbery, and ruling really with an iron fist. So they are the ones that are delighted that at least one aspect of their business would suddenly become something that was legal overnight, and they could continue with impunity and maximise even their profits even further. So effectively, what this means is that those who constantly call for the full decriminalisation of the sex trade are, whether wittingly or unwittingly, in fact defending an entire trade that by all evidence is indefensible. I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you very much, Ruth. That was on so much information, so many truths spoken. So grateful. I'm sure that hard and all as it was to hear, I'm sure we're all very grateful for the work that you do. So listen, I'd like to thank you again and welcome Stella, who is going to now give us her presentation. Stella O'Malley, delighted to welcome you to the Women's Lobby.
Hi there, thanks a million. Thank you, Ruth, that was fascinating. Yeah, I'm a psychotherapist. I'm based in Offaly, and I'm going to talk about gender dysphoria in girls, centred really on Ireland. I had my own intense experience with gender when I was a kid, very young, from around about the age of 3 till about 10. I wanted to be a boy, and I was very intense about it, but I grew out of it primarily because I was raised in a different era and it was ignored. And I moved on and I had my life, and I ended up becoming a psychotherapist in my 30s. And I wrote an article, because I often write articles about mental health and stuff. I wrote an article because I noticed the kind of transgender kind of phenomenon was kind of getting bigger and seemed to be going to places where it didn't quite make sense that it should be going. And I just gave my tuppence worth about where is the representation of all the kids that were me. And I came from a very kind of uneducated point at that point, because I didn't know my stats, I didn't know my research, but I did know my experience. And it turns out that 80% of kids who are left without therapeutic intervention will grow out of gender dysphoria, just like I did. However, these days, an awful lot of children are getting interventions. And those interventions means that number shoots from 80% down to 5%. So if you get medical intervention for your gender dysphoria, you will be very, very likely to go on to cross sex hormones as an adult. And after I wrote the article, I got a bit of pushback, but in the end, I got asked to do a film called Trans Kids, It's Time to Talk, which was very good title, little did I know, because the most shocking thing about 2018 when I did that film wasn't about the gender, which was shocking in its way, but the silencing of debate and the silencing of people who just wanted to ask, well, what's the story? If there's girls like Stella, there's been for thousands of years, there's been tomboys, there's been girls who very vehemently, even in literature, if you look at Jo March and in Little Women, and you look at George and Famous Five, and many, 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 many other references, even my own ancestor, Grace O'Malley in the 16th century, very seriously wanted to be boys, that it's not an unusual phenomenon, and yet it's suddenly been made something very serious, and it's putting an awful lot of kind of narrative and politicization has been put on it. And so I got very immersed in the whole gender situation ever since 2018. And like I say, the silencing of debate really shocked me in 2018. We found, like Ollie Lambert was the director, and he found that he'd done war films for 30 years, but never, he'd been in Iraq and Israel, Palestine, never had he seen such hostility towards a seeking of information than he did with our film, which was about trans kids. It just seems kind of surreal. And so since then, I've become very involved in working with gender questioning adolescents, working with parents who have gender questioning children, and doing various different things around it. And I've really got to know who these, especially these girls are, because it's quite notable that up until maybe 5-10 years ago, there was real emphasis on kind of middle-aged men who wanted to transition. And then it's flipped. And so it's gone from being 75% male to being 70% female who want to transition. And the numbers are startling. Like in Ireland alone, in case people think this isn't an Irish issue, in Ireland alone in the last 10 years, there's been a 2,100% rise in children wanting to transition. And within that 2,100% rise, 5,337% of them are girls. So the girls are really, really being impacted. And when you start analysing it, and when you work with these girls, you start really realising why they want to transition. And it's a combination of factors, but more than anything else, it feels like there's a kind of roles are put upon these girls at an early age, and they're put on more intensely and more narrowly than ever before. It's like almost, we're in a kind of restricted Victorian age. It's not Victorian values that we're putting on them, but it's a very restricted role that we're putting on them. And so a lot of girls, they hit first year, which is around about 12, 13, and they're sexualized from the moment they get into first year. I remember one kid telling me, like, her first day in first year, there was an assembly for the whole school, and the boys from third year, 2 years older, felt her arse and spent the whole time of her first, 20 minutes in school, in her big school. She was mortified, they were laughing, she didn't know where she was going. Like, for what, you're starting off your new school, big school, trying to be cool, trying to be sophisticated, trying to act like you're a big girl, because you are, you're 12 or 13. And the message is these days, and that's a sexual role to be. And like, I've heard of other girls, like, just because they were twins, they were given this poor name. Why? Because there were two girls who were twins with blonde hair in first year, and no other than that. And suddenly there was like writing on the toilet walls about their poor name. You know what I mean? So there's this kind of sexualization on children that is really impacting them. Some of the girls go towards the sexualization, understandably. Some of the girls shy away from it. What I've really noticed about the kids where gender dysphoria hits them is they're quirky, they're creative, they're not very sporty, they haven't really got their tribe, they're often very intelligent, they're a real type. It's, again and again and again, you're going to see these types. Very arty, very often. Huge numbers have comorbidities, with autism is a big one, ADHD, and even kind of unusual conditions like PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome, or whatever it's called. But the point is that they have other issues going on, and that's impacting them, making them feel unusual. and they're kind of looking for their tribe in a very sexualized world. An awful lot of the boys are very poor and saturated, and listening to Ruth, I could really see how those boys would end up being very much commodifying sex because they're so poor and saturated. And the girls are also poor and saturated. They're watching porn more than ever before, and they're being told that there's a certain way to be. I remember I gave a talk just before the lockdown, and it was in a girls' school, and it was a whole year of kids. It was about 160 kids, and I realized every single girl there had long hair. There wasn't one girl who had short hair in the year. Why? Because it's very much a set role for girls to be, and some of them don't really want it. As Sasha Ayad said, she's a great therapist based in America, and we do the Gender a Wider Lens podcast. She said often girls with gender dysphoria say, effectively, I don't feel pretty enough to be a girl. And that's the emphasis these days on girls. And it's an awful lot of pressure, more so than it was in other generations, where if you're not pretty, who are you? Where are you? You know, the emphasis on looks is really quite intense and oppressive to these girls. And so when they say, I don't think I'm pretty enough to be a girl, they're looking for their tribe, they're looking around, and they go online and they find their tribe, and they realize, I'm not girl enough to be a girl, I'll be a boy. Because there's very little room to be gender non-conforming and not put a label on yourself. And I really think it needs to be noted that whenever I meet girls that I think might be budding lesbians, or, you know, they haven't quite found their sexuality, they're the girls who are most vulnerable. If you've found your sexuality in a way you can follow it and you're all right, but if you're 13 and it hasn't budded, it just hasn't started, there is no room for you. There is no place for you, because people are asking you, do you fancy him? Do you fancy her? Where are you? Are you lesbian? Are you hetero? And they don't know what they are. And as a result, they kind of jump into something. I do think one thing that I've really noticed, and I know a lot of the listeners here will understand it and recognize it, is that when I meet a kid who's distressed and doesn't know their place, I might often try and find them a role model in I don't care where from, acting, sport, whatever, somebody that they'll identify with. And if the kid is a budding butch lesbian, there is no role. If there's a lesbian and they're just, I don't know, whatever, an ordinary lesbian, there is no role. I don't have the references points. And I know some of you will suddenly jump on with some people, but they're not very famous and they're not very visual because I don't see enough of them. And I can't reference to my natural gender questioning, gender non-conforming 13, 14-year-old, oh, but what about whoever, because they aren't visible. And it's the biggest issue, I would say, in these girls' lives, is they don't have somebody to refer to, and they don't have somebody that they can look upon and say, yeah, that's a place I could go. That's where I fit in society. And I think as a result, they get lost. And they often seem to, it's really noticeable with the kids who are obsessed with their gender, who agonize about their gender, who agonize about what are they trans, or are they femboys, or are they agender or free gender? They're probably not free gender, but they're one of the various billion names out there that they are. And they're in genuine distress, and it's not something to be dismissed, because their anxiety is high and their tension is high, and yet they don't know anything about their sexuality. They're very disconnected from their body. They're very disconnected from who they fancy. They're not connected with any sort of kind of rising kind of, you know, hormones of I want to be stimulated, or I want to masturbate, or I want to be with them. They are not getting it. They are completely disconnected. They're completely in their mind, and it's rattling around their head. It's like the gender identity has suppressed their sexuality. And it's a real issue. And I don't know how we need to handle teenage sexuality, but I do know that we need to start confronting it, because at the moment we're just ignoring it, and I don't think it's working. I don't think it's helping anybody. And I think it's making people, especially young girls, feel that there's no place for them. If they're not hypersexualized, they need to completely suppress their sexuality. And we need to kind of have some sort of halfway house where a budding sexuality is an okay place to be. And we haven't got it yet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stella. Very interesting, and a lot of food for thought, and it really points out to how this is really a social issue that we really need to start addressing on a broader level. So thank you again for that. So now I'll have to move over to Annette. Annette, hi, how are you? Welcome to the Speak Up for Women conference.
Hi, Christine. Thank you so much. And I'm so pleased to be here, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to read off my notes, and I hope you don't, nobody minds, but I'm too old. I can't memorize things, and I'm so terrified that I'll miss something important. So I just want to say thank you very much for inviting me to do this. I'm absolutely delighted. And you know, what I've heard so far is, it's mind-boggling for women. It really is. What a world. So I want to talk about Tuam Mother and Baby Home. And it was the death of a woman that put my mother on this conveyor belt of abuse that was Ireland's industrial school and mother and baby homes. My grandmother, Annie, died in 1936. My grandfather disappeared, and the children were marched through the centre of Galway, not to care, but to court, where my mother was sentenced to 2.5 years for the crime of being destitute. She was incarcerated, she was raped, she was abused in the place she was sent to as a 12-year-old girl. At 17, she was raped by the caretaker. And as I say, no man was ever charged or convicted for the rape of my mother, which happened when she was 17. This crime was placed solely on my mother, and that crime damaged and shaped her entire life. In 1916, there was a promise of a better future for all Irish citizens. Indeed, a declaration that promised equal rights for all. But 5 years later, Archbishop McQuaid and Eamon de Valera set up a barbarous misogynistic system that placed certain women and children in internment camps. They would be denied basic human rights, and there would be no right of appeal. And their crime would be to fall outside the patriarchal Catholic Church's vision of what a woman's place in society should be. It's a chilling example to me of how easily women's rights can be taken away in a misogynistic state. A woman's place was to be the bearer of Catholic soldiers for the church. Contraception was banned, and any appeal against the role of childbearer for illness, mental health reasons would be flatly denied by a parish priest who was the overseer of the sexual life of his flock. There was only two kinds of women, saints and whoas. Saints had multiple pregnancies, wrecking their physical and mental health. Whoas were the fallen women, the offenders, and they would be dealt with by a church which made the rules and punished the offenders. The long-awaited Mother and Baby Home Commission report has been widely criticised for its failure to place any blame on the church or state, and instead blame fathers, families, society. I'm sure there will have been some families who would be happy to get rid of a troublesome daughter, took full advantage of a system that allowed them to dispose of that daughter. But the report shames itself with a shabby response to the question of 12, 15-year-old mothers, and a curious lack of investigation into why 12 or 15-year-old children came to be in the place in the first place, and why those children were imprisoned in this brutal regime. I have no truck with the narrative of the evil nuns. It reduces the story to a Victorian melodrama and excuses the behaviour of a state that abdicated all responsibility for its citizens. There never has been, and it seems there never will be, a rigorous examination of just how a government abdicated care of its own citizens and incarcerated women who had committed no crime. The state and the church set up a repressive regime that had parallels with Stalin's Russia, and the silencing and shaming continue to this day. The testimony of survivors talking about state-sponsored trafficking of children is compelling and was completely ignored by the Commission. The same Commission that states there was no forced compulsion to enter these institutions, and again ignores testimony from women who were hunted from England and brought back to the institutions by force. My own involvement with Tuam started with a newspaper article that talked about a shocking discovery in the west of Ireland, a sewage tank that was believed to hold the remains of up to 796 children. The newspaper posted the names of the children, and I scanned those names with dread. My mother had one conversation with me about a place called Tuam, a place where she gave birth to a baby girl, who, the nuns told her, had died at 6 months old. My mother had been sent to another place of interment, and the baby died alone. The pain and the sorrow was so overwhelming for my mother. She never referred to this again. And I imagined a small grave in an overgrown cemetery that we would have no hope of finding. That's the obscenity of Tuam. Sorry. The baby still lies unburied, while the state and the church wrangle about the costs and laws. My mother died at 92. She had only told that story at 70, and it was still unresolved when she died. There was no resting place for the child of an offender. Some had no names. Some only lived hours, but each one would have been imprinted on the life of that mother. In spite of the abuse, the lack of care in pregnancy, and a painful birth, my mother could only speak about her bonny baby and the terrible loss. Where did the women find the strength to carry on in a society that silenced and shamed them? Did this same society ever think about the thrown away women and children and the loss of potential from each and every one? The artists, the painters, the politicians, the poets. Imagine a world where all that potential could have flowered. The Commission only looked at 12 homes across Ireland and concedes that up to 9,000 children died in those 12 homes. How many more were lost in total and will remain nameless and voiceless? I've visited Tuam many times. The people are lovely and supportive now and fully understand the wish that we want to take those children out of the sewage tank, identify them, and give them back to families who wish to bury them with their own. The survivors break my heart. Their loss of a life free from blame and shame has shaped them in many ways. Denied education, basic healthcare, healthy loving attachments has kept them apart from community. They lack confidence and feel in some way that this has been their fault. Born wrong, but onto the wrong mother. Who created that shame? I hate to hear the women described as vulnerable victims. They were not. They were made vulnerable, but they were strong women and survived circumstances that are unimaginable. I've talked before about my impression of the Ireland I see today, and some of it still troubles me. The Ireland of the poets, male, who are forgiven many sins and are lauded and lionised. The statues to the women in Dublin caused great hilarity on the tourist buses. Molly Malone, the tart with the cart, Anne Olivia, the floozy in the jacuzzi. But what does it really say about respect and equality for women? Yeats's poem, in memory of Eve Gore-Booth and Con Markovitz, laments the loss of their beauty, but makes no tribute to their remarkable achievements. Eve is special to us in Manchester because she was part of the women's suffrage movement here. The two women were also very fortunate to have been born in a particular place in society that protected them from the ravages of church and state. Poor women, victims of rape, incest, domestic violence, had no such protection. They're still denied justice and a voice in a country that is only now coming to terms with what was done in the name of the church and the state. Gita Sereni has written about the dilemma facing Germany in the aftermath of the Second World War. And the only sane conclusion is that a country needs to face up to the injustices and make reparation and redress. I do not mean the endless rounds of state and church apologies that are utterly meaningless when they come at the start of the process. There were huge human rights abuses in the incarceration camps, and healing can only take place under a human rights process. I'm growing afraid that once again, women's voices are being silenced. When women are silenced and shamed, abuse follows. We simply cannot allow that to continue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annette. That was really such a moving presentation altogether. I'm sure that all the audience feels the same. I'd really like to thank you for sharing such a personal family story with us.
Thank you.
So I'll be back with a question later. So now we're moving to our final panelist. I knocked off my own mic there. Rachel Moran. Rachel, you're very welcome. Of course, I should say, sorry, our final Irish panelist. So Rachel, you're very welcome all together to make your presentation here to our inaugural event.
Thank you very much, Christine. And I'd like to open, excuse me, by saying a huge thank you to Annette, because it's a very moving presentation, I should hope, for every Irish woman, but for many, many of us, myself included, we share a similar legacy. My own mother was born in Castlepollard Mother and Baby Home, which recently got the disgraceful air and it deserved in the media, although I'm sure we'll never get to the fullness of the truth. But I just want to say, you speak for so many women, Annette, not just here in Ireland, but of the diaspora all over the world. And many, many women and men, for that matter, are of the diaspora precisely for this reason. So I think that that's something that's important to state here. So I'm going to give the briefest history of working class Dublin you'll ever hear in your life. I've got 10 minutes, which is all any of us have, and all we can give is a very, very brief snapshot of the area that we feel deserves covering. It may not be known to many people outside Ireland, and even many within Ireland either are not fully aware. For some, probably frankly don't care. And many did, and to this day, benefit from the fact that for 2 straight centuries in this city, 1 full third of the city's population were raised in the Dublin slums, which were more commonly known as the tenements. And I'm sorry for the little ping pong, and I couldn't figure out how to turn my settings off, so apologies to everybody. Now, if you want to read an oral history, this book here, Dublin Tenement Life, by Kevin C. Kearns, really is the book to read, because this is the personal stories themselves. It's an oral history in the true tradition of the word. There are probably 100 or more people's own personal testimonies recorded in that book. And the reason why it's important to bring up where we came from in terms of our class-based background is that it intersects with sexism for a particular way for the working class women of this nation. A second book that's an interesting read is The High Society by Justine Delaney Wilson, which is a book that really gives you an insight into how the habits, the modern day habits and behaviors of the middle and upper middle classes impact dreadfully harmfully on working class people in this city and every other city and village and town. Because what we're really looking at here is a class stratified society that is so deep and so immovable that actually academic studies have been done into the whys and wherefores. It's so difficult to move between the classes in the Irish context. 3 of my 4 grandparents were born and raised in the Dublin slums. One of them was from a farm down in County Kerry. And we're much, much closer to that piece of history than a lot of people realize. The areas that we would have considered satellite towns, you know, in recent decades, like Cabra and Finglas and Tala, were built or developed in the first place in order to facilitate the people from the slum clearances from Dublin's north and south inner city. And both of my parents in the 50s would have been moved out. You know, my mother from Rutland Street, just up the road, actually, to just off Mountjoy Square, and my father's side of the family from the Liberties up to Cabra. So people really need to understand, I suppose, if they're interested at all about class, the intersection of class and sexism in Ireland, what was really going on here. There has been an enormous whitewash, I would say, at all levels of our history. And I think probably the biggest thing, although it was a scandal in its day, but it's never ever discussed now, is the fact that at the point when the tenement housing started to physically collapse in upon its inhabitants, killing entire families and buildings full of families, which were, by the way, herded together like cattle, 10, 15, 20 to a room in these tenements. It was then discovered that the landlords were to a huge degree actually members of Dublin Corporation, which, you know, now known as Dublin City Council. So what you were looking at was a kind of a cannibalization in the social sense of Dublin people by other Dublin people. And I know that that's a very strong word to use, but if you take a look at this history and what actually went on in this city, to give you an example, when my auntie emigrated to the United States in the early 1960s, and I'd asked her why she'd left. And her response really shocked me. We had this conversation, the guts of 20 years ago. And she said, because I was sick of looking at barefoot children rifling through bins looking for something to eat. So that's how close we are to that piece of history. It's in our auntie's times. And why is this relevant today? Well, it's relevant for a whole lot of reasons that I don't have enough time to go into. But what I'll give you two examples. One is what's going on right now in terms of abortion in this country. So we've been told that abortion now is free, safe, legal. Well, it's free, safe, legal, depending who you are. That's the reality. Because when a woman is, and particularly women who are 40 years plus, who are in the danger zone for fetal abnormalities, I've never heard this mentioned, by the way, in the media, which doesn't surprise me, because the media, just like academia, just like the NGO world and so on and so forth in this country, is dominated, not predominantly, but almost all by middle and upper middle class people. So you won't hear this from exactly the circles you ought to hear it from. But if you go into a maternity hospital in this country, any maternity hospital, you will not be tested for fetal abnormalities until you're 20 weeks. And now you have the option to go private, which is possible from 9 weeks forward. But here's the thing, the cost attached to that simple test is €485. Now that is 4, 5, 6 weeks grocery money for a lot of women in this country, be they disadvantaged working class, be they from the traveller community, be they migrant women. There's hundreds of thousands of women in this country who could not dream of stumping up nearly £5,000 for a test to let them know in time at 9 weeks whether or not they are making a decision that they can in fact live with for the rest of their lives. And that is a huge thing that we need to wrestle and grapple with in this country. Because by the time you're 20 weeks pregnant and you are tested on the public course, you're 8 weeks beyond the point where you can have an abortion. You're halfway through your pregnancy. And it's an enormous repercussion for women. And we've got to put that on the table and quickly. And it's absolutely directly connected to social class and to the fact that what we have in this country constantly is middle class decisions impacting on working class lives. We've had it for centuries. It has not gone anywhere. It needs to go somewhere soon. I'm assuming, Christine, I must be heading on for me 10 minutes. I forgot to put down how far in am I now?
You're getting there all right, Rachel.
Oh, we'd get there in the end. Okay, now the final point I'd like to make.
You have 2 minutes. You have 2 minutes left, Rachel.
Okay, well, I could do this in 2 hours, but I'll squeeze it tight. Yeah, misogyny from a class perspective. We have got to talk about women's prisons and the absolute nonsense that we have got blokes in frocks walking around women's prisons because of decisions that were made by middle class women with zero consultation with the working class women who are liable to be up in clink in those prisons. And I can absolutely guarantee it that the Gender Recognition Act never would have passed a referendum in this country. There is no chance that people up and down the land would have rolled over and conceded to the idea that absolutely anybody who put his hands up and decided he wanted to fill out a single A4 page and get himself transferred into the women's estate or into the women's anywhere, it wouldn't have happened. It shouldn't have happened. The only reason it did happen is because, as I said, we are working class people living under decisions made for us by the middle classes. And we've got to revisit the Gender Recognition Act. We've got to revisit a whole lot of things. But let me just stop it there and say, the women who are traumatized out of their minds in those prisons are having that experience because working class women were never consulted about the material reality of our own lives. A happy International Women's Day, everybody.
Thank you, Rachel. Sorry, just in case the audience are wondering, I've been operating off my phone here. That was a powerful, absolutely powerful presentation, Rachel. Thank you very much. So now I just have time for, and we are running a little late already, we're only on the first panel. So I have time just to ask all the panelists just one very quick question, and I'm hoping that they will really keep their answers brief because we do have a whole panel and there's 5 members still yet to speak. So, so first of all, I'll ask Ruth. Just looking at your findings, and those findings, you know, absolutely all well and good, but what is the point? But what's the point if the government is prepared to leave the prostitution websites to continue operating?
Yeah, great question. Absolutely. The advertisers, the platforms where prostitution are advertised are huge facilitators of the trade and making huge profits themselves from doing that, even though, of course, they claim they're not really advertising prostitution, they're advertising companionship. But anyway, you've seen what the reviewers write in their posts. The way that the main advertiser websites Operation Ireland work is that they basically circumvent the legislation. So in Ireland, it is actually illegal to advertise prostitution, but they just register their company in another country, have their servers in another location, they get around it. But of course, a really excellent way to disrupt the trade is to block or shut off websites like this. So, and we have precedents for that in Ireland when it comes to websites featuring child sexual abuse, child sexual exploitation, that you can block those websites. So the guards, the An Garda Síochána, our Irish police force, are very clear that they want to, you know, make Ireland a hostile place for organised prostitution. But this is something they need to seriously look at, because if they want to do that, if the state wants to do that, if it's really serious about it, it really needs to look at disruption of that kind. Thanks.
Absolutely. Listen, thank you very much, Ruth. Absolutely excellent. This is something really that the Gardaí need to be supported in taking action on. Fantastic. Thank you. And now, Stella, I'm going to ask you, and I know you have really addressed this, but just to kind of really sum it up, I suppose, precisely perhaps for the audience, why are so many girls seeking to transition?
More than anything, as far as I can see with the people I've worked with, is can you hear me okay? They're searching for power, they're searching for confidence, they're searching for strength. They don't feel strong or powerful or big enough in their role as a teenage girl. And so they believe that they'll get it by being a boy. And if you ask them, you know, what is it you're looking for? The words that come up is generally confidence, power, strength. That's what they're saying. Now, I would say there's an extra layer that might be kind of not as unaddressed, mightn't be as explored from them, is a disconnection from their sexuality, maybe hiding from their sexuality, denying their sexuality. Even whether it's hetero or homosexuality, they're kind of denying it, they're suppressing it, and they're putting all their energy into their gender identity. As well as that, why they do it is because they're looking for a tribe and they can't find their tribe, and they go online. They're generally unusual, they're very likable, intelligent, kind of quirky, and they find their tribe and all these new ideas and this whole idea of a movement. There's so many things to kind of be attracted to this movement when you're a certain type of kid. And they're the reasons that they go for it. Listen,
Thank you very much, Stella. A wonderful summation there, and definitely something, as I said, I think as a society we really need to start addressing urgently. And now, Annette, I just have a quick question for you too. Again, so I think we were all really moved by your presentation, but just to ask you, what's next now for Tuam?
Well, interesting, Christine. I had a phone call from the Commission a couple of days ago to say the Commission's now been dissolved. They've disappeared with their circus tent. And just to let you know that we're locking away your testimony for 30 years. Should you die, nobody in your family can access that testimony for 30 years. So, as you say, kicked up a big stink and got some form of testimony. But I will get the testimony. I will get testimony. There's a bill before the Dáil around a burials act, but they've already opened Tuam. It's had some of the babies taken out for forensic analysis. We don't know where those babies have been placed. So why they now need to enact a law to do what they already started, none of us are very certain. So the state tells me that they're done with me now. The survivors will get a few bob, which is the usual crap, and some counselling. But I'm not finished with them. So I will be back in Ireland, and I'll be bringing an army this time. And we won't be bringing rosary beads, and we won't be bringing a choir. We'll be coming digging for truth. So we're not done.
As they say here, Annette, more power to your elbow. Absolutely. And I know that so many people, the vast, vast majority in this country, are going to be right behind you, absolutely supporting you all the way. Thank you. Thank you. So now finally to Rachel. So Rachel, we had another question in from the pre-submissions. So any advice on starting up local women's groups, addressing the themes of today's event, and how not to be afraid to raise these issues out loud and in public? Rachel?
So sorry, I forgot the unmute button. You know, it's a great question on the face of it. And I thank the person for the question, and I mean no respect or disrespect when I say I actually believe it's the wrong question, because what this question seeks to know is how to proceed in the absence of fear, right? And what I'm saying is, if you're looking for the absence of fear, get out of the women's movement. There's plenty to be afraid of. You will not proceed in the absence of fear, and nor should you, by the way, because you should be aware of what you're up against. And it is frightening, especially when you have a whole global cabal that you're up against that has captured the universities, the public sentiment, legislation in multiple different regions of the world. I should hope you're frightened. If you're not taking it seriously. The real question is how to proceed in the face of fear. And my answer to that would be just the same way you walk down the road. Just keep putting one foot in front of the other, even if your knees are knocking. Right.
Listen, thanks, Rachel. Indeed, yeah, feel the fear and do it anyway. I know exactly what that feels like. So listen, thanks so much to the Irish panel. You've just been absolutely fantastic. I know there's so much for us all to digest after that. So without further ado, and given that I think we're already over time, I'm going to turn to Miriam now and hand over to Miriam to introduce the international panel. So over to you, Miriam.
Thank you very much indeed, Christine. That was tremendous, brilliant. I'm just going to give a minute or so for the others to get their videos on. I think everyone is almost lit up there. Yeah. Great, fantastic. Thanks again, Christine. So again, just want to reiterate a good evening to everybody and welcome. And first of all, I want to thank the Irish Women's Lobby for inviting me to moderate the international panel at this wonderful International Women's Day event, and to congratulate them on this new venture. I think it's very exciting to see the emergence of new women's groups in Ireland, and in particular those that attest to an agenda for radical change. And as Rachel said there at the end, you know, that are ready and prepared to embrace the fear. So let me start by extending a Céad Míle Fáilte to our 5 esteemed guest speakers, and an equally warm welcome to the 500 plus attendees who are logged on at the moment across Ireland and throughout the world. I mean, I want it's worth noting that in recent years, as we have witnessed a global escalation of in political extremism, in nationalism, xenophobia, women have become an easy target for those who seek to subdue, moderate, or obliterate the voices of women from public discourse. And I think this has been addressed, you know, with some of the speakers on the earlier panel. We have the hubris of a lot of single-issue activists and unrepresentative NGOs who've hijacked the rendering of feminism in Ireland. And recent attempts by various women to freely associate or organise together has been framed as seditious, whilst forming alliances of solidarity with our sisters overseas is declared an act of treason. So in light of the testimony we've heard already from our previous speakers, it's not difficult to see why the patriarchs of the state and the sex trade capitalists might indeed want to moderate the voices of Irish women. So for this reason, it is heartening and almost subversive, to be frank, to be sitting here this evening in the company of our wonderful panelists, who without further ado, I will now introduce to you. So our first speaker is going to be Julie Bindel. Julie is joining us from England and is a journalist, a feminist, a campaigner, a writer, a broadcaster, and a researcher whose extensive work has addressed concerns about male violence against women and children, with particular regard to prostitution, stalking, religious fundamentalism, and human trafficking. Julie has authored over 30 book chapters and writes regularly for The Guardian newspaper, The New Statesman, Truth Dig, The Sunday Telegraph, and Standpoint magazines, and she appears regularly on the BBC and Sky News. This evening, Julie will address freedom of speech for feminists who advocate against male violence. So you're welcome, Julie. Our second speaker is Clara Berglund from Sweden. Clara is Secretary General of the Swedish Women's Lobby, which is a non-partisan, independent umbrella organisation for a broad range of women's organisations in Sweden. Clara contributes to many European and international policy forums on the issue of women's rights, and this evening she will speak to the convergence of the far-right and neoliberal movements and its impacts on women's rights. Welcome, Clara. Our third panellist is Yamur Garci. Yamur was born in Turkey, grew up in Italy and France, studied in England, and is joining us this evening from Paris. A graduate in political science, she's a member of a group called Radical Girls, that's girls with a lot of S's at the end of it, which is the young women's movement within the European network of migrant women. Yamur has been conducting research on prostitution and veiling for several years, and her texts are available in English, French, and Italian. This evening, Yamur will speak on challenges facing young women today and what they can do about them. Yak Shamlar, Yamur. The fourth international speaker is Dr. Kathleen Stock. Kathleen is a professor of philosophy at the University of Sussex, and she's written extensively on aesthetics, fiction, imagination, sex, gender, and sexual orientation. She has a growing interest in feminist philosophy, including the nature of sexual objectification and the nature of womanhood. Her recent book, titled Material Girls, Why Reality Matters for Feminism, is currently on pre-order, and in January of this year, Kathleen was awarded an OBE in recognition of her services to higher education. This evening, Kathleen will speak on freedom of speech in academia. So you're welcome, Kathleen. And our final speaker is Gail Dines, joining us tonight from the United States. Gail is Professor Emerita of Sociology and Women's Studies at Wheelock College in Boston and has been researching and writing about the porn industry and sexual violence for more than 30 years. She is the founder, president, and CEO of Culture Reframed, which is the first organisation to recognise and address hypersexualised media and pornography as, and I quote, the public health crisis of the digital age. A consultant to governmental bodies internationally, Gail has been described as one of the leading anti-porn scholars and activists in the world, and her book Pornland, How Porn Has Hijacked Our Sexuality, which was published in 2010, has been translated into 4 languages. Tonight, Gail will speak to you on the industrial nature of pornography. You're welcome, Gail. So that being an intro to all of our guests, I will remind everyone that each speaker will have 10 minutes to speak to their topic. And I'll start now by inviting Julie to take the proverbial floor. Julie.
Thank you, and I'm really thrilled to be with you. I wish I was physically with you, of course, but maybe next year. So I really appreciate the invitation to speak about women-only spaces and the sex-based rights that feminists have fought for. Not just second-wave feminism, but our 4 sisters, going way back, well over 100 years. And I think we need to recognise where the pushback is coming from. In my view, based on plenty of evidence over a number of years of being targeted by extreme trans activists, where this is coming from. Have capitulated and gone along with this ideology. And just in case we need reminding, men have always hated women-only space for the simple reason that it not only excludes them, but it prevents them from monitoring and controlling what we do. Now, if this sounds over the top, have a think about the times that you women have been in a bar or just out with a girlfriend or a small group of all women, and men will come up and say, what are you ladies or you girls doing on your own? Now, I remember being at a fundraiser where there were almost 500 women, and I was going down the stairs from the venue to a shared bar where there were men drinking and talking about why there were so many women upstairs. And one of them said, there's about 500 women up there on their own. And I pointed out that it's a little bit difficult to be on your own if you're with 499 other women. But of course, once he clocked that many of us were lesbians, it changed then to, can you give us a bit of kind of girl on girl action? How about a sex show? Some kind of naughty girls sharing their huge toy kind of porn genre, because of course men have to always be involved and they can't bear women to autonomously organise. And that's what it's about. Now, women-only spaces are not just crucial to avoid kind of unwanted attention, sexual harassment, sexual assault, but also to be able to disclose to other women, to each other, about what men do to us. And we all know that for generation after generation of women, until we get together with other women and say, my husband beats me, he rapes me, I was flashed at as a girl, I was sexually assaulted by my stepfather, I was raped by my gym teacher, I'm being sexually harassed in the workplace and I feel like I'm to blame somehow. Until we talk to each other about that, we can't possibly know that it's not just the odd, crazy man and that we're not inviting this attention unknowingly. And that is the bedrock of the women's liberation movement. We know that the second that one man is in a room of women, students and academics will know this. If there's one man in your seminar group, the atmosphere changes instantly. The dynamic changes. Half of the women will resent him being there and suspect his motives. And the other half will run around defending him and speaking up for him. And actually praising him, giving him a special prize for being the only man there, feeling sorry for him. So if we think about how that actually moves from women being often too nervous or frightened to say to men, we want this space for our own, to how that translates into the law, it's crucial. Early second wave feminists, not just in the global north, but in the global south also, physically built refuges and rape crisis helplines, safe houses for women and their children to escape violent men, to report violent men. That's what we did. We did it without pay. We did it without grants. We did it without funding. We built them because we needed them. And eventually we managed to get them mainstream, but they've always been under threat. If we didn't have male violence, we wouldn't care. It wouldn't be an issue. I personally wouldn't really care about seeing a piece of gristle hanging down between a man's legs in a changing room if I didn't think that he might rape me. And the one thing that women around the world share, because many, many things divide us, but the one thing we all share, women and girls, is the fear and reality of male violence. Now, by that, I don't mean that we walk around needing smelling salts, that we're constantly imagining that we're going to be raped. What it means is that we recognize the threat from men. The threat that comes with, in my country, one woman every 3 days being killed by a former or current partner, by woman after woman after woman being raped. We know that this is the reality that binds women together. And we know that's why we've got single sex spaces and why we have, because we fought for the right for that to be enshrined in law. Now everything is under threat. And all of the feminist activists and our allies on this webinar will know that nothing's ever carved in stone, that struggles mean that you take one step forward, two steps back, that we have to fight constantly to maintain and even grab back the rights that we lose over and over again. If men didn't terrorize, beat or kill women for the simple reason that we're women, there wouldn't be any need for any of these services. But the offence of rape, certainly under most legislative frameworks, specifically determines that this is penetration by a penis. And on the end of that penis, contrary to some popular beliefs, there is always a male person, always. So why would we then rewrite reality and science and suggest that male violence somehow becomes not a threat at all, in fact impossible, because it's being committed by a trans woman? We know across British prisons in England that 50% of trans women living amongst the women's estate are convicted sex offenders. Convicted. Do we all know how rare it is to get a conviction when a man rapes or sexually assaults a woman or child? It's nigh on impossible. Let me just give you a figure from my country, which is that from the rapes reported, and we know that that's the minority of assaults on women, the rapes reported, only 1.5% get to court, and around 65% of those end in a conviction. We're talking about a 1% conviction rate at the moment. Now, if you're a woman who's been raped, you are very likely more, well, not just very likely, you are statistically more likely to go to prison because of the chaos and trauma that that rape causes you than is your rapist. This is why we give a damn about trans women in women's prisons. These women are the most abused on the planet. And then a tiny bit about the ideology that underpins this. As I said at the beginning, this is pure misogyny. This is men wanting their rights. This is perfect for the liberals, for the so-called progressive men who say they support feminism, until we say that we actually want them out of our spaces and we have our own rights, because it affects the rights that they have over us, even the gay men. So the pro-prostitution lobby that Ruth Breslin spoke about earlier, it's the same lobby as the extreme trans activists. They greet me at my talks, my public talks, shouting, blowjobs are real jobs, telling me that trans women can only make money for their surgery by doing sex work. When I launched my prostitution book in 2017, I was met with this baying mob of blue fringes. And at the same time, Rachel Moran was in Italy launching the Italian version of her book, and she had a similar mob, different country, same bullshit. So what do we do about it? We cannot capitulate. We cannot. The more we actually stay silent, the worse it will get. Extreme transgender ideology is even seeped into the animal rights movement. There's a woman who joined an animal rights group in Washington, D.C. I interviewed recently, and she was reprimanded by a non-binary member of her group who told her it was hurtful to hear her describe the abuse of female cows in the dairy trade. The non-binary member said, "You're not allowed to say dairy comes from female cows or eggs, come from female chickens, because we don't know their gender identity." This is not a parody. This is not a joke. What we have to do is demand that we have and maintain our single-sex spaces and our laws, and don't let any organisation take them away from us under the guise of trans rights. Until men stop raping and killing us, this is our right, and we have to stand up for this and tell men, if they find it so threatening that we have our own spaces, stop abusing us, and we'll be perfectly happy, I'm sure, to see you walking around a changing room with your bit of grizzle hanging down in between your legs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie. I think I remember, excuse me, a couple of years ago hearing you tell a little anecdote that when trigger warnings were first introduced, there was a trigger warning called Trigger Warning Julie Bindel, and I think it's understandable, having heard that, why that might well be. And some interesting issues there to talk about, particularly I think the relationship with public spaces and women's limited access even to navigate public spaces. We have it on license, you know, we have it on license for a certain number of hours of the day, for a certain number of months of the year. And as you say, that threat hangs over all women because of the actions of a few, you know. Thank you very much, Julie. Okay, I'm now going to call on Clara Berglund, please.
Thank you so much, and so impressive to hear your Swedish as well. I'll see if I can share my PowerPoint. This. So just like described, I will talk about how different forces come together to threaten women's rights. And I will give you just a quick descriptions with some examples, but this is a longer, much longer talk, and I think it will be an inspiration, and you can think about it in your own context. So this is why the Irish women's lobby is so greatly needed. It's needed because women and girls are in danger, and there is a war going on against us, and our rights are under attack. And beware that it's a two-front war. So the first front, you have probably heard about it, it's the anti-gender movement. And then in Sweden and many other countries, we have progressive politicians and activists that are coming together to fight the conservative and far-right backlash against women's rights. And the background to this is something like this. Throughout the history, we have seen that the Holy See and the Vatican, they have worked very hard to limit the freedom of women and girls. But in the 19th, they changed the strategy and launched a wider campaign against what they call gender ideology. And they focused particularly on questioning gender studies and limiting women's sexual and reproductive rights, such as the right to abortion and such as the right to sexuality education, etc. Soon after that, other conservative religious movements joined this new anti-gender movement. And in the last decade, we've also seen that growing populist and far right-wing movements in Europe and North America have also come aboard. And together they have been remarkably successful. The methods that they use are very strategic. For example, they work to establish new language. They create new NGOs with nice names about dignity and rights, etc. And they pursue legal disputes, both nationally and internationally. Here are just two examples. So an important part of the strategy is to limit and control actors that are promoting sexual and reproductive rights, such as, for example, Planned Parenthood. So the new gag rule that was introduced by Donald Trump is a perfect example of this, restricting all funds to Planned Parenthood and other organizations that offer abortion services and other sexual and reproductive services. The anti-gender movement is gaining ground around the world, but it has a stronghold in several Eastern European countries, such as Hungary and Poland. So, for example, the Orban administration in Hungary has banned gender studies from all universities. But at the same time, the women's rights are also under attack from what I call the pro-gender movement. Or should I maybe call it the anti-women movement? This front of the war is not nearly as known, and we can see that many progressive politicians and even feminists and other activists, they are so eager to position themselves against the anti-gender movement that they actually end up inside the enemy lines without even noticing. The background to this front is that it all started in the 80s and 90s. We had a neoliberal wave that swept over the world. Margaret Thatcher said that there is no such thing as a society, only individual men and women. And soon after that, other countries followed in her steps. And even in Sweden, the Social Democrats introduced deregulation, privatization, and big austerity measures. This meant that left-wing politics, as we've known it before, were out of fashion. And the feminist movement was very divided. And some fractions of left-wing politicians and feminists, they turned to postmodern theories about identities. And this meant that they forgot about women and the working class and oppression. And this shift made it possible for them to survive in this new neoliberal, hyper-individualistic era. In fact, it made it possible for a new anti-women agenda to take form. And this agenda focused on defending, but also reframing sexual and reproductive rights. It wasn't women's sexual rights anymore, it was everyone's sexual rights. And rights were not universal. Instead, every person seemed to be free to define his or her own rights without having to worry about the oppression of women as a class. It's very clear that the anti-women or the pro-gender movement, they use a feminist terminology, but they fill it with neoliberal and postmodern ideology. For example, women's right to decide over their own bodies has been reframed as the right to sell your body on the market. In fact, all rights can be bought and sold in the market in a neoliberal world. The pro-gender movement is very influential here in Sweden and also in many other European countries, as well as North America. And interestingly, they seem to use much of the same methods as the anti-gender movement. They create new and infiltrate existing NGOs. They try to control funding streams. And to do that, they have help from a few very influential billionaires that make strategic donations. But they also use no platforming, name calling, and they especially try to recruit young feminists. And they are very active and very organized on all social media platforms, building on the polarization that already exists within those forums. And I have so many examples of how the pro-gender movement has, with all the resources that they have at their disposal, have infiltrated and turned big organizations and movements. I think this image of a girl taking part in a climate protest says it all. Her sign says, "Destroy my pussy, not the planet." And I think perhaps that Gail Dines or other speakers in the panels as well can testify to where this message comes from, possibly from the porn industry. And also, by the way, did you know that the Black Lives Matter movement wants to decriminalize the sex industry? It's not a coincidence. The other image is an advertisement for surrogacy motherhood. And you can see how they use the feminist discourse. Being a surrogate mother can be empowering for women. Really, to go for the physical and emotional trauma of pregnancy and birth, and then to give up the child that you have carried inside you for 9 months is supposed to be empowering. It sounds exactly like the opposite of empowerment to me. So I have briefly described the growing anti-gender movement, how conservative, religious, populist, nationalist forces have come together to push women's rights backwards. But I've also made clear that the identity politics and the neoliberal ideology of the pro-gender movement doesn't have women's back either. But luckily, there's a third option. The pro-women movement is an opposition both to the anti-gender movement and the pro-gender movement. And us, I call it us because I believe that the Irish Women's Lobby will join us in this position. We have never forgotten that women are oppressed as a class. We believe that human rights are universal and not up for interpretation. And we call on reforms that can improve the everyday lives of women and girls. And lastly, I just want to show you how the pro and anti-gender movement, as well as the pro-women's movement, views a few important feminist issues. So first of all, the pro-women movement, we have a holistic view of the body, as in you are your body, while the pro-gender movement has a deconstructive view of the body, as in the body can be separated from the self. And the anti-gender movement believes that the body is sacred or dirty, and it practices virginity and honor standards. When it comes to men's violence against women, in the pro-women movement, we believe it's important to recognize this violence is gendered and that it requires structural understanding and political solutions. While in the pro-gender movement, this is described as intimate partner violence, which can be solved with individual solutions. And in the anti-gender movement, they call this domestic violence, which should be solved inside the family. When it comes to prostitution, we want to abolish prostitution and to criminalize sex purchase. We believe that women in prostitution are survivors and also victims of a crime. In the pro-gender movement, they want to decriminalize this entire sex industry. They think that women in prostitution are sex workers and entrepreneurs. The anti-gender movement want to criminalize prostitution, with the argument coming from the Madonna war complex. The pro-gender movement, the pro-women movement wants to abolish surrogacy, much for the same reasons as prostitution. We believe that it is trafficking in women and children. But the pro-gender movement want to legalize what they call pregnancy hosting, which means that women make money and childless people can have children, simple as that. And the anti-gender movement, they want to criminalize surrogacy, but for other reasons, because they feel motherhood and life are sacred. In the pro-gender movement, we believe in biological sex and sex-based rights as they are defined in CEDAW, and that women are discriminated against because of the role that we have in reproduction. In the pro-gender movement, they talk instead about gender and identity, and that gender is fluid and a spectrum, etc. And in the anti-gender movement, they have an essentialist view of sex and gender, meaning that gender can never be liberated from sex, which is what we are trying to achieve in the pro-women's movement. So this is just a very simple way of describing those different ideological standpoints that we have in those different positions that we have identified when we have tried to map this war against women that we are seeing around us. And I think that perhaps many of you recognize this picture as well. And I so much again want to welcome the Irish Women's Lobby to this struggle, and I hope that we can fight it together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clara. I mean, that's fascinating information there. I think very useful matrix and analytical framework. I'm sure a lot of the people who are watching will now be able to see where they would plot themselves looking at it in that way. So that's great. And it prompts me just to respond to a couple of the questions that's come up a couple of times in the chat, where people have been asking, are the presentations that are made, will they be available? And so I think some people will certainly be able to make their presentations available, and those who do, we will put them on the website and make them available afterwards. So any of our panelists who are willing to share their slides of that, and we can put them on the website. There was another question asking whether or not we are going to if the videos will be available after the event. And just to clarify, yes, that we will be putting this on YouTube, and I think they will be edited down into individual videos as well as the entirety. So I hope that answers some of the questions in the chat. Thanks once again, Clara, and great work. I now invite Yamur Garci to now, as I say, step up to the plate, as they say.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, women. I had planned something for today, but before going into it, I just wanted to give a shout out to the French survivor-led feminist group called Collectif Abolition Porno Prostitution for standing up yesterday in the center of Paris against a mob of angry, coward, pro-pimping men who suddenly started throwing eggs. I said, we're vegan, what's going on? And next thing we knew, we were just flooded with this. There was a bit of up and down. It was I mean, this time bystanders kind of took it seriously. Some of us went to the police and we said, what are you doing? Are you waiting for the flower? They said, haha, you know, French police, they love a bit of laugh. But it was quite distressing to see every time. I mean, of course, we know what's the point of this, and every year the violence escalates, and this time they were amateurs. You know, last year, some of the members of the same survivor-led movement were beaten up in the same square. So before saying anything, I just wanted us to remember two things. One, first they came, let's twist it a bit. First, they came for the feminists. They are coming for us right now. So wake up. And two, remember that Cassandra was a woman. So the 8th of March, every year, I dread it and I can't wait for it. And it feels like a new year. It's this yearly benchmark that we have. And I really think that we should take resolutions every 8th of March, because we always go on about safe spaces, and it's very important, of course, but we also need to develop a feminist understanding of time. Because there's a first specificity of women's condition, and I will talk about two more today, and it's the fact that the male atrocities committed against us are not historicized. So we hear prostitution has always existed. Rape has always existed. So we are made to understand that it's like God, it never began, so it can never end. Well, obviously that is a lie. And because of this lack of historicization, we also have the difficulty of the feminist movement. Rachel talked about fear earlier. Can you imagine survivors from camps building a political movement against the camps as the camps are going on, and as the structures that allowed the camps to exist are still there? It is impossible. And we women are doing exactly that. We are doing the impossible. And how does time translate at the individual level, and especially for the youth? I feel that youth is a bit overrated. It's evanescent, it withers away. Next thing you know, while you are waiting for change, you get old. And I feel like I'm in this bus stop and I'm waiting for this liberation bus, and I see women who've been there since 1995, Beijing conference, and I wonder when's my turn. And they tell me, you know what they tell me? They tell me 2030, UN Sustainable Development Goals, everything will be achieved by then. And if it's the UN that says it, of course, I mean, it must be true, because how could the United Nations of patriarchy ever deceive women? Because there's a second specificity of women's condition, and it's the in bed with the enemy factor. And Julie talked about it quite a lot. Just like there are no ghettos for women, there is also no promised land. There's no rest for us in this world. And any woman-only space has the potential for liberation. And migrant women in particular know this better than anyone else, because we've been north, we've been south, we've been east, we've been west, and we've seen this patriarchy business all over. And we're not surprised. Any new trick it's going to play, we saw it miles before it was coming. And I wanted to make just something in brackets about migrant women. Please don't patronize us. This Newspeak business, Clara, you've been talking about it as well. We understand it very well. We actually often speak more languages than most. And if we don't adopt it, it's because we reject it, and we will not capitulate. Now, given the men's systematic crushing of women time and time again, and this parasiting all over the world, we women have lost a sense of self. We do not know we are women. And this is why we identify with every other cause but our own. And this is why we say woman, they, instead of we, woman. And this is why when we see a man humiliate and degrade another woman in pornography, we do not see him degrading and humiliating every single one of us. How can I recognize the woman in front of me if I don't recognize the woman in me? And this is why we contend ourselves with expressions like non-men, because we haven't understood that non-men in patriarchal terms doesn't mean woman, it means not being. And this is why we have come to accept the greatest insult of all and have come to believe that men can be women. And we decry the loss of the word woman, and rightly so, because we don't have a name for our sex. But it was predictable, wasn't it? Again, translating at the individual level, we women do not even have a name of our own. We carry the name of our fathers or the name of the father of our daughters. By the way, hence the central importance of surrogacy under patriarchy, because you have to be a father to be able to rule. Now, given this context that we have, this unique situation we're facing, I think that one of the resolutions we can take is to define ourselves positively. And I have just a few suggestions, obviously it's a non-exhaustive list, but I was thinking that perhaps instead of calling ourselves separatists, we should be calling ourselves unionists, like Marina Terrani suggests, to signal the fact that we want to be with every woman together and reconnect. We should no longer say we're against pornography, prostitution, veiling, female sexual and genital mutilation, because the clitoris is not a genital organ. No, we are for women, and anyone defending those misogynistic practices is against women. We are for women, by women, with women. We need a bit of democracy. We will no longer say we will not be silenced, because that is not enough, but we will say exactly like the name of this event, we will speak up, because we know the central importance of speech as social beings. And most importantly, please, women, let us commit to this. We will do the most controversial thing of all. We will be happy. Thank you very much.
Wow, Yamur, that was absolutely fantastic. A lot packed into there. Very, very inspiring. You're a brilliant speaker, and I suspect you will definitely reach a lot of audiences with that. I mean, there's so much there. Our lack of matrilineal heritage, and just the takeaway idea that women should focus on what we're about rather than what we are against, because that very often is what derails us and keeps, manages to dissolve what it is we're trying to do. Thank you very much, Yamur. Thank you. Now, I know we have a little bit of slippage on time, but I'm sure people will be quite happy to accommodate that, because we have a couple of very good speakers coming up. The next speaker I want to introduce is Dr. Kathleen Stock. So, Kathleen, thank you.
Hi, everyone. What a speech to follow. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to be as inspiring as Yamur there. In fact, I'm pretty sure I'm not. But congratulations to Rachel, to Stella, to everyone involved in the Irish Women's Lobby, and I'm really honoured to be speaking. So the theme of the evening is obviously women and girls, front and centre, and another theme is how mainstream, often so-called progressive organisations, including feminist organisations, have failed, utterly failed, and are continuing to fail women and girls. And that damning critique, I'm afraid, includes many in universities, which is what I'm going to talk about. So it might even be true that the problems all start in universities, because a graduate route is the route into third sector organisations and into these progressive organisations is a graduate route. And then these graduates carry with them into these jobs and positions the ideologies they got at university. So I'm a professor. I'm in a UK university. I know I can't tell you what it's like in Irish universities, but I can tell you what is happening in British universities now, with the strong suspicion that what's happening here may well be happening with you. I'm clearly on the inside in many ways. I'm a professor. As such, I'm a member of the academic establishment. Given my job, I'm obviously massively middle class. I'm not claiming anything other than that, but I see practices happening in UK universities which impact particularly on working class women and girls adversely, and which I just cannot accept. So I'll start with a question: what can an idealistic, energetic young woman student expect who's entering university, who's specifically interested in the political cause of women and girls, and who seeks out relevant classes or courses or comrades? Now, there are many exceptions to what I'm about to say, and clearly the work Ruth has done, for instance, at UCD is one such exception. There's powerful female-focused work going on in universities. But a lot of the time, and especially in the humanities, where I am, the answer to what our hypothetical student is likely to encounter is that she's very likely to encounter a so-called feminism, which is steeped in identity politics, and which to my mind has a lot of similarities to the Catholicism I grew up with, and I grew up as a Catholic, and presumably a lot of other religious movements too, which you might think is a bit surprising because it's a university. So, as in religious movements generally, there is a lot of focus on guilt. So a young woman at university who's interested in women-centred politics is immediately put on the back foot, forced to reflect straight away in a guilt-ridden fashion about all the ways she is supposedly privileged. So there's a hierarchy of privilege, and she is asked to place herself in it, and she must focus on what she has that other people do not have. So her so-called cisness, her whiteness, if that applies, her heterosexuality, if that applies, her able-bodiedness, if that applies. So that immediately the positivity and energy she might feel about women and girls generally is channeled into a narrative which divides women and girls into groups and puts them in a hierarchy, and makes her immediately slightly abashed. But funnily enough, class is never mentioned. So you will be told that, you know, white girls or cis girls or able-bodied girls, etc., are privileged no matter where they live or how they live or what has happened to them in the past, and what their socioeconomic background is. That is not mentioned. As in religious movements generally, there are priests, there are academics you are not supposed to argue with anymore, and there are basic axioms and dogma that you are not supposed to dispute. So you have to accept that trans women are quite literally women, whatever that is supposed to mean. You have to accept that sex work is work, whatever that is supposed to mean. I mean, it's hard to express doubts about the value of sexual liberation, in inverted commas, for women and what that's brought. It's hard to raise questions about surrogacy and so on. So you have to start thinking in mantras quite a lot of the time. You have to start suppressing curious thoughts and questions that might occur to you about how it all's supposed to fit together based on what you've seen. When academics like me and others dispute some of these points, these dogmatic points, or if we try to argue that women's interests and girls' interests are different from trans women's interests, for instance, we are attacked, not with arguments, as you'd expect and kind of hope for in a university, but we are defamed by colleagues, we have protests at our talks, we have online petitions signed by thousands to get us to shut up. We are no platformed, we have complaints to our managers, we have positions taken away from us. And that, because we talk about it, because it happens in public, that too sends a message to young women that they must keep quiet, or the same thing will basically happen to them. And in religious movements generally, as well, there's a lot of toxic behaviour masked under the guise of being moral and being a good person. So there's a lot of pious talk about inclusivity and being kind, where this is used to keep girls in line. The fact that younger women and girls are socialized to be kind, submissive, and altruistic is weaponized against them to minimize dissent. And the high priests and priestesses, because there are many priestesses of this approach, will simultaneously talk on the one hand about inclusivity whilst signing off on a witch hunt for those with views they don't like. So the picture is depressing, and I don't have a lot of good news really. I mean, it matters for the students, clearly. It's their education, and they're missing out, and it matters for their future formation. It also matters for policy, because as many speakers, including Rachel, has already pointed out, policymakers just take often instruction from academics without consulting more widely or democratically. It's quite ironic, it seems ironic to me, that when the Gender Recognition Act discussion started in 2018 in Britain, and I started to express my reservations about it, it was often said to me, but they've got it in Ireland, and it's all fine there. And I thought immediately, well, how the hell do they know? Because I bet nobody has looked. And it turns out nobody even knew that the changes in law and policy had been made here. So there's a kind of cabal just basically deciding what's going on, and it's profoundly anti-democratic. It also means academics cannot explore, from the perspective of females, women, things that matter to women, many things that matter to women: pornography, femicide, prostitution, surrogacy, these sorts of things that so powerfully have been described today. So you might ask, why is this happening? And I think that's a big conversation. It's a perfect storm of lots of different things. Clara has mentioned some of it already. It's the disproportionate influence of post-structuralism and queer theory on the humanities in particular in the last, I don't know, 40 years or 30 years, plus some really misguided philosophical assumptions. So some academics have come to the stunning conclusion that there is no such thing as women and girls as a genuine group. They've literally argued that. I mean, so that means people like me have to spend our lives arguing for things that half the world know are trivially true, but we have to convince academics that they're true. Partly it's because academia is always looking for the new hot take, and after a while just trying to work out what might be good for women and girls is dull, apparently. You're much more likely to get kudos from colleagues for doing research on queer bodies or whatever. So here's a quick slide, if I can get it up. Sorry. Here's a quick slide. I've shown this before, but I did a quick search of major feminist journals for keywords. I searched anywhere in those journals from 2015 to 2020. I looked for the word queer. I looked for pregnancy, maternity, menstruation, and menopause. And you can see that queer is the word that comes up most, and pregnancy comes up a bit, and things like menstruation and menopause hardly come up at all in 5 years of feminist discussion. So that's just, I mean, that's entirely unscientific as an approach, but I think it gives you a snapshot of the kind of priorities of people. And I'm not saying, I mean, I'm a gay woman. There's nothing wrong with exploring gay lives, trans lives, but the fascination that it has for middle class academics is disproportionate to its impact in the real world, I think. Okay, so academics always looking for the new hot take, but also it's just middle class academics like me being middle class, pursuing their own interests and what matters to them. And the guilt that they are inflicting on everyone else is their guilt. They feel guilty about their undoubted privilege. And because they're also paternalistic and they think that they know better than everyone else, they think others should feel what they feel too. And this is all exacerbated in the UK university, where fees are paid, students are customers, universities are in competition with each other for customers, and managers are increasingly terrified of academics saying anything which might ruin their reputation and mean that they won't get as many customers. So they're going out of their way to present universities in customer-friendly terms as warm, fuzzy, welcoming, safe spaces and communities, which is fine. You know, you'd want, as a parent, you'd want your child to go off to a nice, warm, fuzzy, welcoming, safe space. But as academic Cass Sunstein has pointed out in his book on social conformity, the more a group, any group, presents itself as a community, the harder it is for members to dissent from practices they disagree with. So the stronger emphasis there are on social bonds, the harder it is for people to speak out and go against the grain when they don't agree with what's happening.
Yeah. I'll have to call time on you there, Kathleen. I think we're, yeah. And again, it's very interesting to see, first of all, I think a lot of people who have been watching this happen over a number of years have been quite disturbed to see this sort of capture, for want of another words, of academia and that sort of subversion. And I think even back in Ireland, then we have, you know, it raises questions even relating back to what Rachel was saying earlier on, because the state pays the fees of all third level students here. So we have a free fees initiative. So essentially the taxpayer is financing significantly the third level institutions, yet they have this autonomy that they're separate corporate bodies. And in some instances, some of them still have the legacy of the Catholic patronage, you know, where they have reserved places on the board of governors. So there's a lot of unpicking to be done there, and very interesting to see how that's impacting on the sort of things you're talking about and how you get a shift in terms of what universities do. Thank you, Kathleen. And finally, it gives me great pleasure to introduce now our last speaker from the United States, which is Gail Dines. Gail, you're welcome. Thanks, Kathleen.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you everyone for this great panel. And I'm sitting here thinking of Andrea Dworkin's comment that radical feminists are not fun feminists. And I think we've given more than empirical proof. We're not a fun bunch here, but we're an important bunch and crucial for changing the world. So what I'm going to talk about today, and I'm just going to share my screen, is also not fun at all. In fact, is extremely depressing, which is why we absolutely have to organize. So I'm going to talk about the political economy of the contemporary porn industry. And if you're thinking of porn in anything like Playboy or Penthouse or even Hustler, forget it, right? Those were kind of, in a bizarre way, the good old days. And I never thought I'd live to say this, but I'm somewhat nostalgic for these images, given what we are absolutely swept up by today. So let's look at what's happened to mainstream porn. So to understand the shift from Playboy, Penthouse, and Hustler to the absolute hardcore mainstream porn, we have to first understand that the domestication of the internet around 2000 made porn more affordable, accessible, and anonymous. The 3 A's that drive demand. And it shouldn't surprise anyone that a lot of the money that developed the internet came from the porn industry. The pop-ups, the pop-downs, the paywalls, the payment systems, all those were developed by R&D from the porn industry. So porn sites get more visitors each month than Netflix, Amazon, and Twitter combined. Right, so we're not talking about some small industry here. We are talking about an industry that is shaping the sexual templates, the culture, and is reinforcing patriarchy minute by minute. Now, let's talk about what the porn industry does. Porn industry, like all other industries, raise capital, undergo mergers and acquisitions, organize trade shows. They even have their own lobbying organization, disgustingly called the Free Speech Coalition, talk about the bastardization of language. They have PR firms, and most importantly, they interface with banks, credit card companies, venture capitalists, cable operators. It means that they are threaded through mainstream corporate capital in a way they never have before. And when I argue against the porn industry, and people say to me, well, if you do anything about it, it'll go underground. You know what? That's exactly where it should be. Because when it comes above ground, it is knitted so deeply into capitalism that all of these organizations, from banks to credit cards to venture capitalists, have a vested interest in the continuation of the porn industry. So what we know, and this is from Adult Video News, which is kind of a porn business website, the corporatization of porn isn't something that will happen or is happening. It's something that's happened. Now, why is this so crucial? It's crucial because it means the concentration of capital in mainly one company called MindGeek. Virtually, I would say 80 to 90% of the porn that is consumed somehow comes through MindGeek, which is based in Montreal. And at the moment, actually, there are hearings going on finally in Canada looking into the workings of MindGeek. If you go onto their website, you will never see the word porn anywhere. They call themselves search engine optimizers and leaders in IT. They have flown under the radar for 15 years. Finally, a light is being shined. Now, MindGeek owns 10 of the 15 most popular and lucrative porn sites in the world. And the most important one they own is Pornhub. Pornhub is one of the top 10 visited websites in the world. It's up there with Google, YouTube, and Facebook. So again, I want you to get a sense of the size of this industry. So just let me give you some statistics from 2019. 42 billion visits to Pornhub, which was up from 33 billion in 2018. Daily average of 100 million visitors. 962 porn searches per second, and they've uploaded nearly 5 million new videos with 1 million hours of new content. There is so many million hours up there now that why do you need even more? And as Andrea Dworkin once said, there's never enough pictures. Now, Pornhub boasts that 100 million daily visits, as if the combined populations of Canada, Poland, the Netherlands, and Australia visited Pornhub every day. Now, what's on Pornhub? Well, the gold standard study is Anna Bridges and her team, who found that 90% of the most watched scenes had at least one form of violence against women. Now, Anna Bridges and her team have just updated that study, and it's due to be published next year. And you know what that figure is now? It's not 90% anymore. You know what it is? 100%. Now, I feel like I'm making this shit up because it sounds so ridiculous. But it is 100% now of the most watched scenes have violence against women in them. And what is this violence? It's from gagging with a penis so far down her throat that she can't breathe. She's choking, and as she's choking, the tears are streaming down her face, and the guy who's choking her is dragging her head and pulling the penis even further closer to her. So sometimes, and they keep this in, she vomits, and they keep that in the scene. Strangulation, hands around the throat, which is especially dangerous because, first of all, we know from studies that women who are battered and strangled by their batterer are more likely to die at his hands. Number two, you can be strangled, pass out, wake up, think you're fine, and it can take up to a week for your passages to swell. So you can die a week later in your sleep. Rough anal sex, pounding anal sex, to the point that one of the biggest problems of women in the porn industry are what are called anal prolapses. Literally, their anuses drop out of their body. Ejaculation on face, known as the money shot, hair pulling, spanking, spitting in the face. The average scene on Pornhub today is a woman being orally, anally, vaginally penetrated, being spat upon, being called bitch, whore, cunt, cum duster, and then finally they ejaculate in her face and often in her eye, to the degree that just before they closed down, before COVID, there was an antibiotic resistant strain of gonorrhea of the eye going around the porn industry for women. Pornhub traffic during the pandemic. So what was Pornhub's gift to the world during lockdown? Within a week of lockdown, they made their premium free. So most of Pornhub is free, but then they have this firewall, the premium, where they have the more upmarket produced, all violent, just more technologically sophisticated. In the lockdown, right, the first week, visits to Pornhub in Italy went up 57%, France 38%, Spain 61%. These are women and children locked down with men using more porn than ever before. In the US, porn traffic went up 40% at 3 a.m. The reason Pornhub gave is people go to bed later. People, they mean men. And what men were doing is not going to bed later because of work, lack of work. They were waking till their family went to sleep so they could access Pornhub. And then we have now the phone system, which for Young people has meant they now have even more access to porn. 84% of teens use Instagram, 80% use Snapchat, 69% TikTok, 39% Twitter. Now, how do you get to porn if you've got a cell phone and you're a teen? You get to it through Instagram, you get to it through Snapchat, the two main platforms. Sunny Leone, one of the biggest so-called porn stars, and there's only a handful of porn stars, most are porn performers. She's got 40 million followers on Instagram, a teen site, and I went from her site on Instagram to Pornhub within 7 seconds, which means a kid can do it in 5 seconds. We know on Snapchat, they have Snapchat Premium, where they've hidden all the porn behind Snapchat Premium. And again, you can get to Pornhub straight from Snapchat Premium. Now we have OnlyFans. Now, OnlyFans is the new type of porn, which is, I think, going to take over the porn industry. So let's give some facts. It was founded in 2016 in Britain. Now, it is a camming site where women make money from monthly subscriptions, creating custom content for fans. They also get tips and they also get money every time they message the fans. It has 90 million users, over 1 million, it says content creators, which really means women on there. The platform takes 20% at the moment. You'll see it go up. It'll take 30, 40, 50% of the women's income, and the women are subject to doxing, capping, which means capturing their screen images and then uploading them onto Pornhub, and men making money off them, death threats, and also they have what's called a referral program, which means that if you get a friend to come on to OnlyFans, you get a percentage of what she's making. So it's really a pimping system. You're getting women to pimp out other women. So how is this all affecting our culture? The best way to put it, Details magazine, which is kind of cosmopolitan for men, they said there's an entire generation of young people who think sex ends with a money shot to the face. Money shot being, of course, ejaculation on the face. We know this from studies. In one study, when they asked men, what is the one thing you really want to do to women? They said, come on a face. And when they asked why, they first said, well, I feel powerful. But in the end, the real answer, when the questionnaire, when the interviewer dug down, you know what they found? They found that he said, I really like to do it because I know she hates it. This is what porn has done. It has shaped men to get off on sex that women, or porn sex that women hate. Remember this? These were the glory days of radical feminism. Hundreds of thousands of women protesting pornography. Nobody was calling it empowerment. Nobody was calling it sex work. Nobody was talking about cis women. Nobody was talking about individual empowerment. We were talking about liberation. And the movement that I joined was one about liberation, which meant I might be fine. But you know what? If she's not fine over there, I will walk mountains to make her fine. That is the feminism I joined, not a feminism that makes individual women of privilege empowered. I have got so much empowerment, I don't know what to do with it. But that means shit for the women who come in and clean my classes after I'm done. So that's the feminism we need. When you go to info at Culture Reframed, you can find out more. But I want to end by saying, now is the time as radical feminists that we refuse to be silenced. We've always refused to collaborate. But we, not only do we declare war on patriarchy, we have to declare war on this faux feminism that has drained women's energy, that is absolutely hijacking the feminist energy of young women, turning them into arguments that they are empowered, love BDSM, and actually are siding with the patriarchy. It is our job as feminists to save our sisters. We stand on the shoulders of our foremothers, and we have to make our shoulders strong enough for our daughters to stand on them. That's what radical feminism does. So thank you very much, and I'm going to exit my screen.
Thank you very much indeed, Gail. I was visualizing there when you were speaking, 500 women sitting at their kitchen tables with their mouths open in shock, really, at some of the statistics that you generated there. I think it is sobering, it's overwhelming, and I think that's part of, I think, will be the result of tonight's webinar, is that people will be overwhelmed, and maybe that needs to happen. You know, we need to have a sense of the scale and the complexity of the challenges at hand. But incredible, great work, and really sobering to see the statistics there in front of us. Okay, so I'm just going to go on now to the questions and answers, and let me just give a time check. It's 20:34, so we're a little over, but we're not too bad actually, all things considered. Not by Irish standards anyway. So we have had questions submitted, you know, via the website when people were registering. So we have a question for each of the panelists, and maybe if you take about a minute to answer each one. So the first question is for you, Julie. And the question is, what might the consequences be if single-sex spaces became obsolete?
Feminists would lose a battle that took decades upon decades to win, but more importantly than that, all women everywhere would lose the right to prevent male violence, to escape male violence, to organise as women fighting patriarchy, to be lesbians with the definition that we decide is appropriate for us, not queer, not non-binary, not trans men, but lesbians. It would have a devastating effect on the murder rates of women, on the statistics regarding violence against women around the globe, and it would take us decades upon decades to get back from that.
Very succinct. Thanks, Julie. Clara, there's a question here for you, and the question is, what do the different threats against women all have in common?
Thank you. So actually so many things, but so for starters, we can see that the neoliberal and left-wing identity politics and the far-right conservative threat against women's rights, they have in many ways similar economic policies that are hurting women and girls, but perhaps more important in this context is that they have the same view that sex and gender is forever connected. So the conservative view, of course, is that your sex determines your gender, but the neoliberal view would then be a bit simplified, of course, but that the gender determines your sex. You should sense your sex according to match your gender expressions. But so in that way, they have the similar positions, but with different arguments. But for us as radical feminists, it's about liberating gender from sex so that women and men, boys and girls can behave and express any way they like. And I think that what we see in Sweden, and I think all over the world, is that all the time us radical feminists are being accused of being conservative and religious, and we can see that our oppositions, the pro-gender oppositions, are trying to link us to those the conservative backlash, but we have to do the same thing with them. We have to show all the common denominators between the neoliberal postmodern identity politics as well as the far right and religious populist agenda. So we need to use the same method back at them.
Very good. Thank you, Clara. Thank you. Yamur, there's a question here for you, and it's, how can young women resist the pornified neoliberal sexist culture that's been imposed upon us?
There's a lot of qualification of that culture there. There's a lot to untangle. I mean, my heart goes out to even young women, even younger than me. I think Stella's presentation really captured that really well. I can only give my personal coping strategy for this. And when it gets really overwhelming, I think about the Stepford Wives and the film, the original film from 1975, very good film. And I think about Joanna Ebart's character played by Catherine Ross. It's really worth a watch. It's on YouTube, it's free. And she has this long speech where she's talking about the perfect pornographized woman. And she's going on and on about her. And she says she'll be perfect and she'll cook and she'll clean and she'll be wonderful, but she will not be me. And I think this is why I'm in this pursuit of sense of self, because it makes you realize that I can only capitulate at the cost of losing myself. And this in turn reminds me of Nawal el-Saadawi when she says women have to pay a price anyway, so why not the price of freedom?
Excellent, Yamur, thank you very much. And Kathleen, a question for you. What can young radical feminist students in universities do to challenge the grip of third wave feminism?
Well, they first need to get together with each other if they can identify themselves to each other. They need to have those conversations, then organise. So if they've got fight in them, there is a precedent now in the UK, in Bristol and in Cambridge, at least there are two radical feminist student societies that put on events. And so if you've got the fight in you to do that, you should. If you're feeling intimidated, I would think meet up with other radical feminists in your town. They don't have to be in university. There's lots of radical feminists emerging, because the good news about all this is that because academia and the third sector can't talk about women anymore, the grassroots can. So the grassroots are emerging. We can see it tonight, and it's absolutely brilliant. And that is where all the energy, the power, and the freedom of speech is. So they get out of the university and join in there, and then maybe you can bring it back into the universities later.
Thank you, Kathleen. And finally, Gail, there's a question here for you. And the question asks, what is the latest research saying about the effects of pornography?
Well, there's lots of new research coming out, but one of the main things is showing the way that, as the other speakers have spoken about, is how women have internalized the pornified view of themselves and are sort of co-opting it and taking, really giving up a sense of feminism, instead embracing a sense of the pornified women. And I want to mention something that Yamur said about the Stepford Wives. You know, when I originally wrote Pornland, I wanted my book to be called not Pornland. I put it in and it was called the Stepford Sluts, quote, because what I was talking about was how in the 1950s men wanted for capital and patriarchy wanted the Stepford Wives, and now in pornified society we want the Stepford, quote, sluts, because what it is a way in which patriarchy and capitalism shapes the needs and then imposes it upon women. So I think what women are really doing now is really losing a sense of what it means to have a sense of themselves outside of this pornified culture, to the point that they self-objectify. And studies show that the more they self-objectify, the more depressed, the more anxious, the more likely they are to have suicidal ideation. So it's really on us, I think, to go out and help these young women navigate this awful terrain that they are living in. Because I don't think many of them remember what it's like to grow up in the days of radical feminism. It was fantastic. For those of us who are older, just remember how great it was. And to think what these poor young women are now denied is terrible.
Great, yeah, thank you. Thanks, Gail, for that. Now I'm going to try and wrap up as succinctly as I can. I know sometimes it's a nice idea to be able to kind of get a pithy way of stitching, you know, all of the commentary together, but I'm not even going to do that. I think each speaker's work, you know, is so separate and so individual, it wouldn't do it justice. I would, at this point, like to say a very, very big thank you to all of tonight's panelists. We really are truly honoured that all of you have taken your time and intellectual labour to attend an Irish event. And I would ask that the attendees to please go and check out all of the speakers' websites and follow them on social media to stay connected with their work. I also want to thank very much the 500 plus attendees who attended tonight's event. And to those of you who shared and promoted the event, to your own social media followers beforehand, an extra special thank you to you too. A very quick reminder to those who were asking about donations, the Irish Women's Lobby now has a buy me a coffee option on the website. It's a virtual coffee, and I think the link might also be posted in the chat as we finish up here. A virtual coffee donation is €5, and for anyone who is in a position to contribute, your donation will go towards the cost of web hosting for this and maybe for future seminars, which I'm reliably informed are already in the pipeline. So finally, I'd like to close this International Women's Day event by paying tribute to a somewhat obscure reference in many ways, but I thought I would like to give a shout out to Hedy Lamarr, who, though well recognized as an actor, is less celebrated as a scientist and as an innovator. And Hedy Lamarr developed the communication protocol which gave rise to Wi-Fi. And it's this legacy, I think, that is enabling us as women to connect across the world from our kitchen tables this evening. And I think it's very powerful that we can use this technology in quite a subversive way in many ways, and hopefully it will be a mechanism through which we will be able to get a revival of more feminist action. So I just wanted to name check her there for anyone who mightn't have been aware of that. So all that remains for me, I think, is to sign off by wishing you all a very happy International Women's Day and a very good night from Ireland. Ihawaii.
Thank you.